I'm going to talk a little bit about general liability, so you again understand what is covered. And as I mentioned earlier, there are primarily three areas that a general liability policy addresses in order to protect your organization. The first one is bodily injury. And when we talk about bodily injury, we're talking about a wide variety of circumstances. It could be a slip and fall claim somewhere around the church. Somebody trips down the stairs on an icy sidewalk in the parking lot. And it could be more serious. It could be a permanent and serious injury, perhaps in a sporting event, a recreational event, something off premises. Could be wilderness camping. It could be hiking, climbing, water skiing. Many charities are involved in a wide variety of activities nowadays to bring youth into the church. Another form of bodily injury that sometimes is covered in an insurance policy, but again, you have to address this and review it, is the entire issue of abuse, molestation, harassment, and so forth. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit later on. The second type of issues addressed by general liability policy is property damage. And again, this is where your church, perhaps something you do on your property causes damage to your neighbor's property, where you rent a facility for a special event. Maybe your sanctuary isn't large enough to have a certain event. Maybe you don't have a gymnasium and you have to rent another facility. And while you're using the other facility, you, your participants, your volunteers cause damage to that property. You leave a tap running, you do something in the kitchen, something electrical where a fire started, not intentionally, but simply through mistake. The owner of that building has their own insurance for their building, for their fire insurance and other forms of damage. But there is a principle called subrogation, where after their insurance company pays the claim, that insurer can come back and sue the responsible party. And this is where property damage coverage comes in under your liability coverage. And the third area is what's referred to as personal injury. Now, personal injury is not a bodily injury, it's an injury of reputation. This is where your organization or one of your representatives says something, perhaps in public, in a letter, that causes libel, slander, defamation, and nowadays a big concern is invasion of privacy. Releasing information publicly that somebody didn't want you to. And it could even be through a mistake. It could have to do with financial information, personal medical information. It could be something as innocent as talking at the front of the church from the pulpit during a Sunday morning on a prayer request, and perhaps disclosing a medical condition of somebody as part of that request without their consent. Now, some important points to remember about general liability insurance. As I said, it's a traditional form of insurance that's been around for a long time. It covers risks with the highest potential for damages and awards. And when I say that, what I mean is that bodily injury in particular is the #1 contributor to multi-million-dollar liability suits. And when you think about it, and you think about what your organization does on and off premises, we're not talking just about one person suffering a serious and permanent injury. You could perhaps have multiple children, youth, or adults hurt in the same accident. And when you think about potential liability suits, you need to recognize that this is why you see claims in the multi-millions of dollars, because you do have victims who may have suffered paralysis, may not be able to work for the rest of their life, may need medical care, rehabilitation, and those damage awards are oftentimes very, very high. So when you think about your $1 or $2 million liability policy, you have to realize it sounds like a lot of money in one sense, but in another sense, in a large lawsuit, it might be enough to pay for the legal defense costs, but not for any actual settlements. And that's the reason why so many churches are upgrading their liability, their general liability specifically, to 5 or 10 million or more. Again, keep in mind that if it's not excluded, as it is with most insurance policies, but if it's not excluded and you're with an insurance company that offers abuse coverage, abuse is a form of bodily injury. Okay, and this is where it would and should be covered. General liability coverage is an occurrence form coverage, and this is important to remember when we talk about directors and officers liability. What this means is that when you have a claim, an accident happens, somebody at your church reports the claim to your insurance agent or broker. What that means is that claim will be reported based on when the accident happened. So for example, if you have a slip and fall claim this week and somebody is threatening to sue next week, what you do is you report it under your current insurance policy. That's when the occurrence took place. But as is the case many times nowadays, liability claims don't come up till perhaps months or even years after the event happens. And again, what you do is you go to the insurance policy that was in place during the time frame of when the event occurred. And that could be the same insurance company in a previous policy period, could be a completely different insurance company. But again, keep in mind, as with your automobile insurance or your homeowner's insurance, you go to the policy that was covering you for liability at the time that the accident or the event took place. Most general liability policies have traditionally carried coverage for what are called compensatory damages. Compensatory is just a term that means it's compensating a victim for something that they've lost. Now, they can be financial losses, like I was hurt, I wasn't able to work, and that's why I'm suing you. I'm suing you for lost wages. Or provincial hospitalization didn't pay for all of my medical procedures. Or I had a dental claim. I had to have a lot of dental work done. I don't have group insurance at my place of employment, and now I'm going to be out of pocket thousands of dollars. Or another example would be non-financial compensation. And this is where we get into this whole term, mental anguish, mental injury, pain and suffering. It's not something that could be quantified financially in terms of a dollar loss, but it's still compensation for something that somebody has lost because they suffered an injury. Most general liability policies, in fact the vast majority, only cover compensatory damages, which is fine and good because that's most of the damages awarded in a court. The problem is nowadays in courts, they are starting to look at awarding damages other than for compensation. And these are referred to as punitive damages, exemplary damages, and aggravated damages. There are reasons why these kinds of damages are now being sought in courts, and a lot of it has to do with getting around pre-existing caps that courts have put on how much can be awarded for compensatory damages. To prove these other damages takes a little bit more in a court. There's a higher bar or burden of proof to prove them. But the problem is for consumers thinking, oh, we've got liability coverage, we don't have to worry, and then to find out that their liability policy only covers compensatory damages is a big shock. And so one of the things that we certainly recommend to consumers is to make sure that their policies cover all insurable damages, not just compensatory. Not only does the general liability policy cover the organization, but it can and should also cover directors, officers, employees, and even other parties as additional insureds. The reason for this is that when you are acting as whether paid or unpaid representative of your church or charity, you can actually be named in a liability suit as well as the organization. And this is a common pattern in liability claims. And obviously it's of a concern for people who, have their own assets, their own homes, their families, their livelihoods, and they want to protect them. So another good point to remember is to make sure that your general liability policy does cover all these other parties while they're acting on your behalf, and even extended to include members, adherents, and volunteers who could be acting as committee members, as Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, and so forth. Now, in talking about general liability insurance and talking about limitations, I'm going to discuss some points that insurance brokers or agents don't usually talk about, but it's important to understand, and that is exclusions. exclusions for certain kinds of events that either are just not insurable at all or that should be covered under a different type of policy. And this is a list of the exclusions that are in a standard liability policy. I'm going to explain them, but I'm going to break them down a little bit in two categories. The first category are things that are not insurable by our industry in general in Canada in 2008. And these would be liability you might have for causing mold conditions. In other words, somebody sues you because you oversaw a building or owned it where there was mold, and where they are now suing for whether it's health-related or you sold them a property that had mold in it which was hidden. These kinds of claims are generally excluded across the board in our industry. Likewise, pollution claims where you cause air, water pollution. There are some policies that give a degree of pollution coverage called sudden and accidental coverage, which means that for a certain time period, if it happens and you catch it right away and it causes damage, your insurer will cover it. But what your insurer will not do is cover seepage that's been going into the ground, for example, from, let's say, a discarded underground oil tank that wasn't taken out, wasn't removed, and has been seeping into the ground for 30, 40, 50 years and causing all kinds of environmental damage. These claims can be huge, but your present insurance company is not going to take responsibility for that. So again, in terms of thinking of duties of care, of diligence, of overseeing your property, and in the area of risk management, this would be an example where something's not insurable and you need to take action and survey for these kinds of things. Other examples of uninsurable risks, terrorism, war, civil war, nuclear energy incidents, both of those categories are not going to affect the average church. One other exclusion I'll mention is criminal or intentional acts. If a policyholder or an organization commits a criminal act, and it's more likely it would be an individual, that the insurance policy will not cover that individual for civil damages as a result of their criminal act. Now, I'll just quickly mention here, in the case of abuse claims, what that means is even if you've got abuse coverage, if somebody is a perpetrator of abuse and are charged and convicted, they can expect no satisfaction, no indemnity, no coverage from the insurance policy. You can't legally be indemnified when you commit a criminal act. It's just a non-starter. However, that does beg the question, what happens to the organization and its leaders if they are sued for that person's actions? And the answer to the question is simply, if you have abuse coverage for vicarious liability against other parties because of the acts of a perpetrator, the other parties are covered for civil damages. Now, the other category of exclusions are certain kinds of risks that require special coverage or separate coverage. And abuse can be one of those cases where coverage is written on a separate section of the policy or under a separate policy. Professional services, if your charity happens to be involved in providing professional accounting, engineering, or legal services, and you have those types of professionals on staff, you may need special supplementary coverage. Employment practices, if you have a large staff and are concerned about wrongful dismissal claims or employment-related humiliation, harassment, or discrimination, that kind of coverage is available under a director's and officer's liability policy. The other category is owned vehicles. If your organization owns a van, a bus, or even a car used by your pastor or staff members, this type of coverage needs to be addressed through a separate primary automobile insurance policy. It's not covered under general liability.